We're in a series called Remember, where we're walking through different texts in the biblical narrative that remind us of the importance of remembering who God is, what God has done. I encourage you to be here, and not just be here and listen, but to implement some of the practices, the habits that we've been talking about, the rhythms into your everyday life. My goal is not just to dispense information to you each week, but for God to use the preaching and teaching of His Word to shape your life as you seek to follow Him. So in my office, which is outside of our house, we took what was once a kind of third garage and turned it into an office. I work from home in my Monday through Friday job, and so I needed an office space, and so we converted our building into an office space. And above my office is a large amount of attic space, more than is in our main house. And so if you were to go into that attic space, you would find multiple tubs, just old school tubs that are filled with, divided by each older child at this point, memories of that child. So multiple tubs for Kaylee, multiple for Reagan, multiple for Zach. And in those tubs are school papers, yearbooks, trophies, medals. I think Kaylee's original kind of blanket that she had when she was just a toddler is in there, which is just like a string of knots tied together at this point. Reagan would be filled with little dolls and trinkets that she had, little kind of girly things. Zach's would be filled with some sports memorabilia and things like that. But each one of these tubs are filled with memories. There's also a tub in our main house that's being filled with things from Levi's life. Does anybody else have these type of tubs and memory boxes and things like that in your houses, or about your children or your family history? Back old school, when we lived away from my parents and would come home, a time or two a year, we would usually be home around Christmas. My kids were younger. One of the things they would do is my mom had albums and albums, picture albums, and she was into scrapbooking for a season of her life, which was a very popular fad for about 6 minutes, and then with technology that kind of went away. But those are all still there. And back in those days, when my kids were younger, they'd pull those albums off the shelves every single year and look through all those old pictures and all the old memories and be told stories in the process. These memory books, these things that call us to remember, that rarely get looked at, if we're being honest, but when we do, there are memories there. There are more sophisticated types of memory boxes that you might have heard of called time capsules. Time capsules are when people take a moment in history and put it into some type of preservable box and bury it, or put it in a special location, and it's opened decades or even centuries of time later. One of the most popular ever, in late 2014, a repairman was fixing a leak, a water leak, at the Massachusetts State House, and he uncovered a brass box of two of the former Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere, who's most known for his famous "The British Are Coming" horseback ride in the night. And then the second Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, who's most known, I guess, for beer. Is that what he's known for? He's another Son of Liberty. But they had placed this time capsule in there in a cornerstone to mark the building's construction back in 1795. When it was finally unsealed the next year, 2015, it contained a treasure of preserved artifacts, including newspapers and coins dating back to the 1600s, a copper medal with the image of George Washington, and most exciting, I guess, if you're a historian, was a silver plaque that was most likely the work of Paul Revere himself that read these words: "This cornerstone of a building intended for the use of the legislative and executive branches of the government of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was laid, this cornerstone was laid by His Excellency Samuel Adams, Esquire, governor of the said Commonwealth. I guess there's the answer to our question. He was the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But so 2014, this was put in place in 1795. That's quite a memory box that was uncovered. So we read a passage this morning from Joshua chapter 14 about the significance of memorial stones in the text. Let me give you a historical context of what's happening in Joshua 4 to help set the stage for the importance of these memorial stones. So kind of the overall landscape here, if we're opening up the tubs of what's going on in the life of Israel, there's a few things happening here. One, the Israelites have been on this journey, right? This incredible journey that started as an exodus out of Egypt. This Israelite journey, exodus out of Egypt, where they were slaves for 400 years. They were delivered from Egypt by God under the leadership of Moses through miraculous events, the parting of the Red Sea. We spent week 1 in our series looking at Passover. Passover was instituted, and Passover was a celebration, a reminder to remember what God had done. They had spent the last 40 years wandering in the desert due to a lack of obedience and lack of faith and disobedience. Was it again because the journey took that long? They were wandering in the desert because of a lack of belief in what God could do. And in the desert, this older generation that had come out of Egypt dies. And there's a new generation that's about to enter into the promised land. New generation entering a new land that God had promised to them. So this Israelite journey, and there's a kind of a built-in danger here that reminds us that we tend to forget where God has brought us from. We tend to forget from where God has brought us. We tend to forget our Egypt. We tend to forget those areas where we have been held captive by sin's grip. We tend to forget the destruction that it caused in our lives. We tend to forget our desert moments, those moments of desperation where we have to cling to God. We have to rely upon Him. We tend to forget those moments where we were wandering without purpose or aimless through life. And so all of us have been on a journey, and for the Israelites, they are at this kind of crux in their journey where they're about to cross over into the promised land. Second thing that's going on in the life of Israel at this time is there's a big leadership transition. There's a transition of leadership, a passing of the baton from Moses, who's kind of the Michael Jordan of Old Testament Israelite leaders, right? He's the GOAT. He's the greatest of all time. And Moses is passing the baton to his right-hand guy named Joshua. I would not want to be in Joshua's shoes following Moses. Can you imagine? But there's this leadership transition from Moses to Joshua. Moses, because of some circumstances, Moses is not allowed to enter the promised land. And so leadership transitions to Joshua, who is known as this man of faith and courage. He is one of the people from the older generation that is able to enter the promised land because of his faith. He exercised faith when others did not. He exercised courage when others had a lack of courage. And so Joshua is being given the reins of God's people, and he is to lead this new generation into this new land that God has promised. So think about it. Joshua, he's a successor to Moses. He's a military leader. He's a person of faith and courage. And his leadership, and this point in Israel's history is crucial. It's crucial to bring together the tribes of Israel, to unify Israel, and it's crucial for the conquest of Canaan, which is the primary city in the promised land that God has given them. There's kind of a built-in danger when we think about this leadership transition. We tend to forget the faith that has been passed to us from previous generations, that we stand on the shoulders of centuries of Jesus followers who have paved the way for us. I'm not talking about here like traditions of Should we sit in pews and sing from books and those type of things? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a faith that is thousands of years old, of the good news of the gospel of Jesus that has been passed through all different types of styles and methods and gathering places and generations and nations and tribes and tongues. We stand on the shoulders of those people, and we tend to forget the stream of redemptive history that we stand in. I'm afraid that we tend to take our faith for granted because, if we're being honest, it doesn't really cost us that much. The generation and when we live, the place and the culture in which we live, it doesn't really cost us a lot. And so we tend to forget the sacrifice that has gone before us. So there's this leadership transition, this journey, this leadership transition. And then when we get to Joshua chapter 4, there's this crucial moment in this story, the crossing of the Jordan, the crossing of the Jordan River. The Jordan River is the final physical barrier that is separating the Israelites from the Promised Land. Crossing the Jordan River symbolizes the end of their wilderness wanderings and the start of their new life in the land promised by God. If you read the story, like the Red Sea, God miraculously stops the waters of the Jordan. He controls nature. He stops the waters of the Jordan. He allows the people to cross over on dry ground. And this event marks both the confirmation of Joshua's leadership, right? He's the man in charge now. The confirmation of Joshua's leadership, and bigger, the fulfillment of God's covenant promises to generations of his people, going all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That God is fulfilling his covenant promises to his people. So this is a monumental moment in Israel's history. All these things have happened. Deliverance from Egypt, wandering in the desert, transition of leadership, crossing the Jordan. This is a monumental moment in Israel's history that will help shape their entire future. And so the Lord instructs Joshua in this moment to erect a memorial so that they might remember the significance of this moment. We heard Whitney read it, we'll read it again. Chapter 4, verse 1. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, so again, God stops the waters, the people pass over. The Lord said to Joshua, take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight. Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God in the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, implying they will ask, when they ask, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. 12 stones symbolizing the 12 tribes of Israel are to be taken from the riverbed of the Jordan and set up, if you go on to read, in this local community called Gilgal, as a reminder, a tangible, physical reminder of God's faithfulness. Now, setting up stones as memorials was a common practice in the ancient Near Eastern world where the Israelites were. These memorials often marked significant events or covenants between kings or divine encounters. As a matter of fact, if you are a Bible person, you may remember the story of Jacob, one of the sons of Abraham, and then Isaac, and then one of his sons, Jacob, one of the twins, Jacob and Esau. And when they have a bit of a skirmish, Jacob is sent away and he spends the night in the desert. And if you remember, if you're a Bible person, you remember the story of how Jacob had a dream. And this dream was of God, the angels of God, ascending and descending a ladder symbolizing the presence of God, the nearness of God, that God was with him even when he was running away and sleeping in the desert and not at the top of his game, that God was still there. And so when Jacob gets up the next day, he sets a memorial. He sets up a memorial. He calls it Bethel, the house of God. And it was the same idea. It was a memorial that reminded him and reminded those who would come in contact with it of the presence of God. And so this was a common practice both in that time and in other places in the scriptures. It is important for God's people to remember this moment, to remember who God is, to remember what God has done, to remember from where they came, to remember where they are going, to remember who they are, that they are God's people, to remember what awaits them. The promised land that awaits them is based on God's covenant promises that he has made through generations of time. And so that's what happens. Bounce down to verse 19. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. Remember, these things are marked like calendar time. 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal at the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal, and he said to the people of Israel, notice the instructions here. When your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? So here's our purposes. You shall let your children know Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over. So that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever, that you may stand in awe of who God is. So these stones are set up in a place called Gilgal. This is kind of their first encampment in the Promised Land. It serves as their base of operations during their conquest of Canaan, which is an entirely different story. That's the march around the wall 7 times, and the walls came tumbling down. If you remember the kids' song, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Remember that? And the walls came tumbling down. That's the Canaan story. And so before that, the Gilgal's kind of their place of encampment, is where all of that is going to take place. And so notice that God says here, the purpose of these stones is a teaching tool, right, for the future generations. They're going to ask, and you're going to tell them. It's a testament to the power of God. It's going to be for the rest of the world to see the power of God, and it's a reminder of who God is. You're going to stand in awe of who God is. So Gilgal becomes a significant religious site for the Israelites. When the Israelites pass over, they renew their covenant to God in Gilgal. They celebrate the Passover for the very first time after crossing over the Jordan into the Promised Land. It's there that they remember and celebrate the Passover. And then another kind of interesting piece of information, this is one of those in the text you're like, do what? It's there that this new generation of men, remember this is a new generation, so mainly 40 and under, this new generation of men are circumcised as a sign of their commitment to God. Like, I don't know how that conversation went down. When Joshua shows up, it's like, all right, dudes, gather in. Here's what God's told me. You're all getting circumcised. There had to be somebody in the crowd like, can we vote on this? Or like, do we get a say here? But this is what's happening. God is renewing the covenant, the commitment. All these things are taking place in Gilgal. So this memorial will not only help them remember who God is and help them remember what he has done, but it will fuel them. It will fuel their faith. It will fuel their obedience. It will fuel their victory. It will fuel their witness as they remember who God is, what he has done. And these memorial stones remind them of these things. They're important in the history and the development of the nation, of the people of God. So there are spiritual lessons for us in this text on the importance of remembering, of setting up memorial stones, moments of significance in our lives, things that remind us of who God is, what he has done, who we are. You see, memorial stones are important because we're prone to forget. We're prone to forget from what God has rescued us. We're prone to forget in our times of difficulty and struggle and doubt and sickness and fear and anxiety and depression and worry. We are prone to forget who God is, what God has done, who we are in Him. So let's think about this idea of memorial and how it helps us. It helps us with a few things here. One, it helps us remember God's faithfulness. Remember God's faithfulness. Memorial stones, these moments in our lives, these, in this case, tangible moments help us remember God's faithfulness. You see, these memorial stones were a tangible representation of God's faithfulness to help His people remember His past acts of rescue. And not just past acts, but just as God acted in the past on behalf of His people, He will act again. He is a promise keeper. And just as He acted, just as He miraculously delivered and led and provided for and rescued His people, He will do it again. We sing a song that says that God will do it again, that He is faithful. And we remember His faithfulness because it fuels our faith and our trust to believe that God will act again and that God continues to be faithful. Think about this. What God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that was centuries of time before this moment. What God promised to Abraham in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 when He takes him out on the hillside and says, look at the stars. That's how big I'm going to work. Like your generations will pass and will be that size, Abraham. And there's a land that I will give you. That is generations of time before, centuries of time before that God has been at work. Through a lot of characters, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of different personalities, a lot of different people, that God continued to be faithful generation after generation after generation. And what God had promised Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, through every bloodline, every stream, all the way up to Moses, He is now fulfilling centuries of time later. And through that process, God never abandoned His people. They abandoned Him. They were rebellious against Him. They were unfaithful to Him. They forgot Him, but God was faithful. And they are to remember His faithfulness, that He is the God who fulfills His promises. And we need memorial stones. We need tangible reminders in our lives that remind us of the times that God has shown up, that God has been faithful, to remind us of His faithfulness, to remind us that He is faithful even in our unfaithfulness, even in our seasons of rebellion, even in our moments of forgetfulness, that God is faithful to us. There's something that we can learn from the Israelites here. Like, I don't know if you know this or not, but they were not Facebook savvy. They didn't have technology, and they didn't have tools to be able to get access to information or record things in a convenient way. Do you know what the Israelites did? They wrote things down, and they told stories. They told the stories of God's faithfulness. So this is just kind of a simple illustration, but a few years ago now, I saw this thing that was advertised to me that caught my eye because I knew it was kind of right up my dad's alley on things that he likes and enjoys. Now, there's this company out there, and this is no paid advertising, but they're called Storyworth. And Storyworth is you can buy a subscription, and then the person you're gifting this to, they can write stories. And then at the end of the subscription, they put it into a hardback book and send it to the person. And so we gave this to Dad for a 1-year subscription that turned into like 4 years because he just kept writing and writing and writing and adding stories. And honestly, at this point, we don't know how many of these stories are true, but they're in there. And They have their own flavor to them, and told in my dad's own personal kind of way. And it was a gift that we gave to him to be able to record his stories. And so this came out, and he published it through Storyworth. And even the title of it is Memories Thus Far, which is a very dad, the Hudson Journey, Memories Thus Far, which is a very dad title. And so I know he's read this at least 100 times at this point. And all of us have had the joy and the privilege of getting a copy of it and just looking through it. It's filled with pictures and stories. But the main thing that this is it is this treasury of the written down stories that define our family and our faith journey. So this doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people outside of our family, but it means everything to our family. And honestly, I don't know how he came up with all these stories. My book would be like this thick. Are you with me? Like, I can't remember this amount of stuff. But Dad has got that gift of being able to remember those stories of growing up in a certain generation and all those things where you mainly had to remember and tell the stories that get passed. But this is a tangible reminder for us of God's faithfulness. I think you can get your own copy of this for, I don't know, what is it, Dad, $99.95 or something? This is a tangible reminder for us. You're not going to pick this up at Barnes & Noble. And so this is a very simple illustration to say, like, this is the Israelites wrote things down and they told stories to remember God's faithfulness, to preserve the memories. And that is what enabled them to continue. It fueled their faith. So here's what's important. They wrote down and they told the stories, which is the kind of next lesson, spiritual lesson that we get out of this idea, this text, which is that we are to pass the faith to the next generation. Like, those instructions are clear in this text. Your kids are going to ask. Your kids are going to ask. And you're going to tell them. You're going to tell them the faithfulness of God. You're going to tell them the stories. I like how the memorial stones in the text, that it is naturally assumed that these stones will trigger storytelling. That you will tell the stories because they will ask. You see, the stones ensured that the next generation did not forget the stories of God's faithfulness and His provision and His rescue. And the reason that is important, and I'm saying this on repeat throughout this series, the reason that's important that we do not forget the stories of God's faithfulness, provision, and His rescue is because we are prone to forget. Our hearts are bent toward forgetfulness. And the stones say, hey, next generation, kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, don't forget. Your forefathers lived in a place called Egypt. For 400 years, they were slaves. And God miraculously brought them out. For 40 years, they wandered in a desert. And God provided for them and was faithful and rescued them. There was a few generations ago that God brought us to the brink of the promised land, the Jordan River. And just as He did in the story of the Exodus, when He parted the Red Sea and we passed over and the sea collapsed on Pharaoh and his armies, just as God was faithful in that moment, He was faithful to us on the brink of our generation, that He would stop the river and we would pass over on dry ground. And generation after generation after generation, God is with us. God is faithful. And just as God has been with Moses, He will be with Joshua. And just as He was with Joshua, He will be with you in this generation. And just as He is with this generation, He will be with the next generation. That we pass on the faithfulness of God. Now, passing on the redemptive story was built into the rhythms of everyday life for God's people. One of my favorite texts on this, and we read this usually on parent-child dedication, is Deuteronomy chapter 6. Like, listen how clearly this idea is in Deuteronomy 6. This is back to Moses laying out for the people this idea of a renewed covenant. And here's Moses' words in Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This one phrase was the defining phrase of the Israelite people. They were a people who followed and served God. It's called the Shema. It was like everything in the Jewish way of life was built around this idea. So it's one of the most crucial passages and proclamations and confessions in all of Scripture. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. So that's built in, right? Don't forget who God is. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. He's our God. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of nations, small g gods out there, but there's one God, and He's the one we follow. And our instruction is to follow Him with everything we are. Heart, soul, mind, spirit. So these are life-altering principles, foundational stones upon which they were to build their lives. And then look at the instruction here. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. Like, you have to absorb them. These have to be your words, but you do not allow it to stop there. Verse 7. You shall teach them diligently. The word we've been using is intentionally. You shall teach them diligently. That means the everyday rhythms of life. Teach them diligently to your children. And then he describes it. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. And the Hebrew people took this literal. Like, they had things on their wrist and before their eyes and on their doorposts. These were literal commands that they took. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land, see that? Promised land, new generation. When that happens, when He brings you into the land that He swore to you, to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, houses full of all good things that you did not fill, cisterns that you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, then take care, here we go, what we're prone to do. Take care lest you forget. Lest you forget. Lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Build into your life patterns, build into your rhythms, reminders to you and your children, because when you get into this land, and this land is filled with grace gifts, all this food that you did not plant, this endless supply of water that you never had while you're wandering in the desert and limited in Egypt with the provisions you were given there. When you get into this land and all these grace gifts are poured out on you, you're going to tend to forget. So to avoid that happening, you have to build into your rhythms, into your life patterns, reminders that keep you from forgetting, because you'll forget if you do not build into your life rhythms. And then let me break this down for us, how he says to do that. He says do it when you're sitting with your family, with your kids, when you're sitting. So for us, that means around the table, around dinner or breakfast, or for you Southern terms, supper, whatever your definition is for the evening meal. When you're sitting around the table, have God talks. Let's be honest for a minute. That means some of us have to get off the couch in front of the TV where we're having dinner and sit around the table and talk about what God does, because we have to be intentional with it. So he says you do it when you're sitting, whatever that looks like for you. Everybody's patterns are different, but the point is be intentional in your around the table moments to have God talks with the next generation. And then he says, do it when you're walking in the way. Now, what does that look like? So most of their transportation was by foot or animal, right? If you didn't know this, we have a new way of getting around. It's called vehicles. And so we ride places and drive places and are in the car together. And so for us, that means when you're in the car together, when you're in the flow of everyday life and going from point A and point B, and if you're got a kid that's involved in a lot of things like ours, you're going from point A to B to C to D to E to F, maybe all in a single day. When you're playing chauffeur and when you're taxi driving the kid around, you better be having God moment conversations because they happen in the everyday patterns of life. And then he says, when you are lying down at night before bedtime, you need to be having God talks with the next generation because you're prone to forget. And so we want in our life patterns, and again, sometimes this is dictated by other stuff, right? Sometimes you're at home at 10 o'clock and you're tired and need to go to bed. But most nights and consistent nights, we want to have moments with now just Levi where we have God talks at home about who God is and what he's done and pray over him and pray for things going on in our lives when we're lying down at night. And then it's not just about lying down at night, is it? It's about, and when you rise in the morning, when you get up in the morning and the hustle and bustle of getting ready for school and to go about the day and getting the showers and getting the bed made and the teeth brushed and the coffee made and trying to get things together before you rush out of the door 10 minutes later than you wanted to, don't forget God talks have to happen in the everyday patterns of life to remember who God is, what he's done. See what he's saying here? In every day, throughout the day, in the everyday rhythms of life, pass it on to the next generation. And if your conversations are consumed with everything but God and who God is and what God is doing, then we're not passing it on like God intends. And it really says something to all of us who are investing in the generation, and you are investing in the next generation no matter what season of life you're in. For some of you who are grandparents, this just means occasional because they're with you occasionally. For some of you that don't have kids in the house or have them every other week because of a divorce situation or whatever, this means that is kind of the spread out pattern of your life. But you have to find in the moments that God has given you with the next generation how in the everyday patterns of life to have the God talks, to have the faith talks, to have this is what Jesus is doing, and this is who Jesus is, and this is what grace is, and this is what it looks like. And when the kid is mean to you at school, how do we be Jesus in that moment? And how do we be a person of compassion and kindness? And how do we live everyday life as Jesus-focused, gospel-centered people? And if you're like me, our lives tend to revolve around a lot of stuff that may not be the gospel and may not be Jesus. And so if we're not intentional to make him the focus and to make the gospel the center of our lives, we're going to miss it in the everyday patterns where we're instructed to do it. So, passing it on. We'll go back to our word. Intentional faith talks in the everyday rhythms of life. If we do not pass the faith to those coming behind, it will be forgotten and abandoned. And if you don't believe that, read the biblical story. Generation after generation of generation. That's the cycle on repeat of the redemptive narrative throughout most of the Old Testament. One generation would forget. One generation would be faithful. They would not pass it on, and the next generation would forget. And God would raise someone up to remind them. And on and on and on. Build into your life generational stories of God's work. If you hear the Hudson family talk about God's work in our life, we talk about the pivotal moment of my papa, who was not a Jesus follower in any way, who came to faith in Christ through the preaching of my dad early in his ministry, and my papa came to faith in Christ and changed the trajectory of our family in so many ways. And we talk about faith. It's like we have this story that we go back to about Pap Hud and how God changed his life and set the trajectory for generations to come in our family. Like you have to pass those things on. The God talks, the faith moments to the next generation, because they will forget. And not just forget, they'll walk away. They'll abandon, which is a big thing right now, by the way, walking away from faith, because we've kind of failed to get it into, there's a lot, I mean, we can spend a whole series talking about that, but part of that puzzle is how are we passing on the faith? All right, let's talk about this last one. We also built into this text is this idea that we are reminded these memorials help us testify, speak of what God has done to other people. Like Moses says, hey, don't forget these memorial stones are not just about you. These memorial stones are not just for the Israelites. They serve as a witness to the rest of the world of the power of God, the mighty acts of God, the rescue of God. Remember Jesus' final instructions to his followers before he ascended back to the Father. Take this redemptive story, take this good news of the gospel, and go proclaim it to the ends of the world. Go tell everybody. You see, there's a transition that happens post-Christ. Don't miss this, because Jesus is the fulfillment of this. There's a transition from a memorial in Gilgal of 12 literal stones to, in the New Testament writers pick up this idea. And guess what? Let you in a little secret here. We are the memorial stones. We, post-resurrection, are the memorial stones. Our lives, our witness, our testimony, like these memorial stones in Joshua 4, our lives are to be a testimony to others about who God is and what God has done. One of the right-hand followers of Jesus, Peter, one of the inner three circle, he had a couple of letters that he wrote, and in one of his letters, his very first one, in our English translation is the second chapter, Peter says, you are living stones. This house, this temple that's been built that we call the church is made up of living stones, and you are one of the living stones. And in that same chapter, he says, we who are living stones are called to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of the darkness and into the marvelous light. That we are the living stones, and as the living stones, we are to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of the darkness and into the light. That's that word evangelism. What a scary word. And we have all kinds of images when we hear that word evangelism of placards and people holding up turn or burn signs and people having awkward conversations and forcing and trying to literally scare the hell out of people. That's the kind of images we have. But the idea of evangelism is the idea of what? Telling your story. Proclaiming the excellencies. I love this definition of evangelism. One beggar telling other beggars where to find the bread. Speaking of the excellencies of his grace, his goodness. So, I want to encourage us, City Church, to reflect on the moments in our lives where God has been faithful, to establish rhythms and patterns in our lives to remember and to pass on, and to speak within our circle of life where God has placed us of his faithfulness and his rescue. You see, here's what this did. This act of setting up memorial stones was crucial in shaping, don't miss this word, the identity of the Israelites. That these people, these Hebrews, with all their ups, downs, back, forth, rebellion, obedience, disobedience, God was faithful through all that to his covenant promises. And these memorial stones and other moments like this were crucial in shaping their identity. That in spite all of these difficulties they went through, that they were people, don't miss it, who were chosen, who were loved, who were led, who were protected, people who were favored by God. These are the words that the scriptures use about Old Testament Israel, and guess who else? New Testament followers of Christ, post-resurrection followers of Jesus. These are the words that are used about us. Chosen, right? Loved, protected, favored. And this identity would shape them as the people of God for generations to come. And it is this identity that we now claim through the greatest memorial, the sacrifice and the resurrection of Jesus, that we are his people. And as his people, we are to remember his faithfulness, and we are to pass on our faith to the next generation, and we are to speak of his grace and goodness to the world around us, because we are the living stones. Let's bow our heads for prayer.